in computer graphics, there are two main approaches, different approaches to visual image representation in a computer. One is called raster graphics. The other one is called vector graphics. The raster graphics is the approach which, like, when Photoshop as software is the main tool for raster graphics. In raster graphics, a visual image is represented as a grid or matrix of colored dots. So I will give you an example. So you can open a sample file from you can download sample files using this download link. Just a moment, I will show you here. Download link, you can download sample files. I will use two of them, Eric will use more of them. So, and I will just use one of my sample files. Just a moment. Where is my folder? Should be here. Yeah, for example, this image. This image, so it looks fine. It's a nice, fine image. So now we're starting.
Share your screen, Leah.
Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. I'm sorry. Sure. Okay, thank you, Eric. So here we have a nice image, and now we're starting zooming in, and we see how pixelation increases. And finally, what we see these, what we call pixels. Actually, these are dots of our matrix, which represents our image. So what computer has inside, it just these dots, and it has a color for each dot. So, and Photoshop shows that actually these lines which separate them, it is just how Photoshop visually represents them, but actually they're just dots near each other. So this is how images are represented in raster graphics. And in a way, like, why this kind of representation work? Like, does it make any sense to compose an image from dots? And actually, as many things in raster graphics, this thing is explained by particular qualities in our vision and how our eye sees small objects and how they're like coming together, like how combination of small, say, particles, they in our eye, they form like a bigger article. And I want to show you an example. I'm not sure if you have seen such things. This is, probably you can see it. This is an electronic microscope. So, and this is an album. It's Mont Saint-Michel. It's a very nice monastery in France, Britain. And I want to show you a picture. This is nice pastel picture. And let's see how it looks. How it looks if we use the microscope to see it. So I'm putting the picture, part of the picture, under the microscope. And then I will make a photo, take a photo, no, photo, up. Just a moment, it's, yeah. And the photo is very high res. And you can see that actually this image is formed just from small dots. And this very fine album just formed by small dots of 4 colors: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So, and most of images we are dealing with, if they're not natural objects, they're formed just from very small dots and of just a very limited number of colors. But in our eye, they are all like, they're forming full color images. The same thing is for your screen. Your screen is actually an array of pixels, and each pixel has red, green, and blue small light source in it. So this is how a raster image is formed and what raster image is. So now let's see, for example, this candle. This candle, so we are starting, so when we just open it, it's a nice image. Then we are starting zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. And finally, we have this maximum level which Photoshop allows us. Now my question to you: do you think that this, like, imagine my screen can be bigger. My screen can be as big, like as needed to fit the whole picture given in these big squares. Does this, my question to you, does this kind of representation of this image make any sense? So what do you think? Does it make any sense, or it just, yeah, uh, it's absolutely unuseful? Yeah, you can unmute, or you can type in chat. I do not see chat. Just a moment, I will stop share for now. Yeah, so I don't see this. No. Yeah, I do not see any responses. So no. Okay, anybody? If somebody thinks that this representation is useful, just type something in chat or say something. No. Okay, well, let's continue then. That's so. If we have a smaller scale, then we see this pixelation, right? And from our normal perspective, we see like this image is not a good quality image, so it's pixeled. But if you just make a few steps from your screen and look at the same picture from 2-3 meters, you will see it as a very fine picture. It will be actually a very fine picture, and it will be bigger than this small one which we initially see here. This small one you won't be able to see from 2-3 meters. You will be able to see only this one, and you won't see any pixelation. The thing is, then in raster images, like the quality of the image very much depends on the observation distance. So, and for example, big posters on walls which you see on streets, pixels of these posters, they are also raster images. So pixels are quite big, just you do not see them. You do not see these pixels, you see the posters from a distance of 10-15 meters. So in different situations, we need different pixel size. So pixel size by itself doesn't define the quality of raster image. Then our question is, what does define the quality of raster image? And then the actual thing which defines the quality of a raster image is the level of details which we see on this image. For example, this picture, when we look at it at 100% scale, so it gives us very fine level of details, and we can go even closer, and we still will see very, very fine details in this image. So it is now it doesn't depend what size of pixel we will use. If you use bigger pixel, then it can be a huge poster on a wall. If you use smaller pixel, it can be just a fine photo, quite small, right? So, but the thing is, if we need this level of details, it's a question for us. If we need this level of details, then we will try to preserve it. If we do not need this level of details, then probably we can downsize the image, and then our computer processing power, which required to process this image, will significantly reduce. At the same time, if we ask them ourselves, okay, probably we want even more details, and it's possible in different situations, right? Then we will need even higher resolution, higher number of pixels image for this particular picture, and then we will be able to zoom in even more. And even here, now I'm starting seeing some pixelation, right? So, but if we have more pixels, then probably we won't have pixelation even on this level, and we can use it if we need it for our work. So that's what quality of raster image actually is. Okay, it's all for my part. Guys, if you have any questions, you can ask now. Okay, Eric, then yeah, just
Great.
now.
So yes, it's very important that you guys select images that are of at least high enough quality, depending on what type of presentation that you're going to create, whether it's 8.5 by 11 sheets or 24 by 36 posters. Make sure that your image quality is high enough and that your resolution is appropriate. So we'll move forward with the tutorial, and those downloadable images are just, you can use them or you could download from the internet, whatever you want to play around with. So conventionally, you would open a file, choose open or new, and select the images that you'd like to place. However, we're going to instead take a different route and go to scripts at the bottom and load files into stack. So what this will do is, instead of loading my images as separate files into Photoshop, they will load these images into one file and create numerous layers. And each individual layer will have an image. So I'll select my images from my folder. It'll be prompted here, and I'll press OK. Okay. So while these load, we're going to focus on these tools here, and I'll briefly talk about them. I don't know if I'll have time to go super in-depthly. You'll see they've been loaded and they're all fitting within my artboard. And in our previous tutorial, we talked about layers. So if you aren't familiar with layers, they are order dependent. So you have to kind of switch these images around in order to see what content is behind what. All right, our first tool is simple. It's the Move tool. The shortcut for it is V. And so whatever layer I have selected or active, I'm able to move the content around. There's different options. So this checkbox just means I don't have to select the layer that I'm currently on. I could just select on the artboard itself and choose whatever image is on top and move that around. And you'll know you're moving something when it has that white arrow. Okay. There's a drop-down menu showing the type of selection you could have, either through group or layer. Most oftentimes you'll have the layer selection. And this checkbox just means that you will have access to the transform function for the contents on your layer instead of choosing, or instead of typing Control-T as the shortcut, or right-clicking and choosing the transform function, which is not here. Okay, so you can select this checkbox in order to actively change the scale of your content in the layer. When you have more than one layer selected, you might notice that these are grayed out at the moment, but these are align tools. So when you have more than one layer selected, either through holding Control and selecting the different layers, you can choose how they become aligned to each other. So here I'm aligning through the center or through the left edge, and it's a good way in organizing your information really quickly. I'll unselect those and select just the one layer and move on to the next three tools. So the marquee tool, the lasso tools, and the wand tools are a means to create selections. The first one is very simple. It's a selection through a simple rectangular or elliptical geometry, and you also have the option to do single pixel rows, which I don't see too much of the use for, but they have that option. The shortcut for this tool is M, and simply drag and click and drag your box to make a selection. Anything in this box will be affected on the layer that is active. So you can create your box on this layer, but change the layer, and now whatever my selection is on the pavilion layer will be affected. For the purpose of this tutorial, we will focus on just this pavilion image for now. So what options can I do with the selection tool? I could create a selection independently through this button. I could add to my selection. With the next button, I could subtract from my previous selections and make, let's say, holes in it. And I could create an intersection, which just means whatever the previous selection is, intersecting with this new selection will be the new selection box. There are options to feather your selection, meaning that you can create soft edges or hard edges. And what I mean by that is, right now our feathering is at 0 pixels. So if I were to delete whatever's in my selection box, you'll see that the edge is fairly straight and unbothered. I'll undo that and change my feathering to, say, 40. You can do this by clicking over the feather name and sliding it left and right to change, or simply inputting your value. Enter. I'll make my selection, and you'll notice that even the corners have been rounded. So when I click delete on my image, it's not a simple hard edge. We have a little bit of a gradient of transparencies. So this middle area is completely transparent, while the border somewhat has a bit of a transition spot. I'll undo twice. I'll revert this back to 0. Enter. I'll make another selection again and right click to show you some of the options. You can deselect via the right click method like this, or you can use the shortcut Control-D. And this one you'll probably use a lot, so remember that Control D is deselect. In my right click, I also have the option to select inverse, meaning that it will create a inverse selection of what I've made. So right now, anything that's in the box will be affected, but if I click select inverse, you'll notice that another border is created at the artboard frame. So anything within these two borders, and I'm gonna show you with my cursor, will be affected. So if I were to delete, I will delete this part of the image, just like that. So I'll undo these again. And one more item that you might use is fill. So you can create a solid color that's within this border, which is useful if you're trying to mask something, trying to hide a part of an image that, or create a background. So for this purpose, I'll choose black. And see, it makes a solid black color. But be advised, you are adding this fill color to the layer that has this image, meaning you are sort of doing destructive editing. And the only way to take this out is to undo your actions or go to this panel called the history panel and revert back to a previous action that you had. So what this panel is useful for is just knowing what commands you've already created, and you could revert back to a previous command. However, if you were to hit enter, all these commands that have come after it will disappear. So make sure that you keep it as updated as possible if that's what your intention is. Click V as the shortcut for this selection tool, and we could select this. Actually, no, we have to undo. Okay. So the next tool is a lasso tool. It's a little bit more flexible in terms of your selection. Instead of a box or an ellipse, you can freehand it using the first option. I'm just drawing my border, make the selection, Control D to unselect. I'll right click this again and choose the polygonal tool. And this will create a selection through straight line segments that'll chain together. So every click will create a new angle. I use this a lot. So this is great when you're trying to select your building and you just have to click around the borders of it. Deselect this. And lastly, we have the magnetic tool, which sort of lets Photoshop do a lot of the selection method because it's analyzing what the tonal and color ranges are and seeing if there's a large contrast between where your mouse is hovering over. So here I'm just dragging the mouse. I'm not even clicking and letting the anchors just determine where there's a large contrast and clicking to execute the command. And if in case you are moving your grip and then accidentally do this and do not want that to happen, just hit backspace to revert some of the anchors and you'll be able to continue. You can also click to make your own anchors. And that's really useful when you're at a corner and have to switch directions. So I'll select this again because I want to use this in the scene. The selection is closed when you see that little circle next to the icon, and I'll make the selection. I want to layer mask this, so I could choose that rectangle with a circle in it to create a mask, and now only whatever's selected in the selection box will be visible. Everything else is made transparent, but it is still editable through this layer mask. Our next tool is the wand, and it acts similarly like these tools, except they're more of like a painterly technique. Uh, Here oh, I will instead use this apple orchard image. We could zoom in using control and, oh, I guess I'll just show you the zoom command, which is at the bottom. It's the magnifying glass, and simply choose between zooming in and zooming out as your options, and you could click and drag as well, and then left and right to change your zoom. So with the wand, Photoshop does a lot of the work, and it'll identify an object based, again, on its tonal and color ranges. So if I were to make a selection roughly like this, it'll identify the red is fairly different from the rest of the selection. And of course, I have to select the layer first. And it should automatically identify this part of the image as my selection. Fairly simple. The quick selection tool does the same thing, except you have to paint as opposed to make a grip selection. And there's tools at the top, or modifying properties, where you can add to the selection or subtract from the selection. So I will add. How I made my brush bigger, you can use the brackets close to the enter bar. There's the square brackets. I'll type it in the chat so you guys know what it looks like. The left one makes my brush bigger versus the right. Oh, sorry, the left makes my brush smaller versus the right will make my brush bigger. So Control D again to deselect. And lastly, we have our magic wand, which identifies a pixel and makes its selection based off that pixel. So I have different sample sizes that I could choose from. A point sample will mean that I am selecting literally that one pixel that I'm clicking on. And I'll select like pixels or similar pixels to that color and tone. What I don't have checked on is contiguous over here. And so what that does, if I were to select it and then deselect my current selection, is that it will not select all the pixels that are similar in the entire image. It'll select all pixels that are similar to it that are touching each other, so within a boundary. So you can see I have a lot of green surrounding this little area, so it should only select this patch of color. Otherwise, if you want to select everything that's within this color and tone range, see all of the sky in the background, I'll deselect, uncheck contiguous, and make my selection, and that should be able to choose all those similar colors. We want to keep anti-aliasing on for basically everything because it smooths the edges, the edge transition of your selection. And you'll notice with a lot of poorly done graphics is that if it doesn't have the anti-aliasing, they'll have really weird jagged edges, especially when you zoom in. So that's something you should mostly keep on. What your tolerance does is that it offers a larger range of pixels above and below that pixel that you selected. So you could have a range of 40 above and below in terms of the value of the selection and the color of the selection. So the smaller the tolerance, the more rigid the selection is. And so only these pixels were similar to the one that I selected. If I made it larger, say 200, it's gonna basically start selecting everything. And going back to my sample size, if I clicked a larger sample, say like 31 by 31, it's going to select a larger area, and that'll give you more of a larger range of pixels to select from. So it's basically selecting a lot of things. I would advise to use point sample or a really small sample size. Great. Any questions so far? If you do, just send them to the chat and I will look at it continuously and answer them on the fly. Our next tool is crop, which is for the shortcut, simply cropping your image and artboard. You can use the grips and the handles to change your crop dimensions, or you could input them here at the top. This will be the width and the height. So I could change this to 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels. Enter to apply the change. I will undo, and we'll move on to the next tool, which is frame. If you've used InDesign, it's like the frame tool, where you have a box that your image will fit in, and you could still edit the image inside. It's just it will have basically a clipping mask to it. I'll switch to the mountain layer, have that activated, and create a frame that's slightly smaller, and you'll see that it'll become clipped. Double clicking inside the frame will toggle between being able to edit the frame versus being able to edit the image inside the frame. I'm not a big fan of the frame tool, but it can be useful if ever you need to place content on top of content and have to clip certain parts of it out. I will be able to delete my frame by selecting this thumbnail on the layer, right-clicking and selecting delete frame. You can choose to delete the frame and contents or just the frame. For now, I will delete the frame, and now my image is back to normal. The next tool is an eyedropper tool, which selects colors and adds it to your foreground color. We have our foreground color here and our background color. And what this means is that you could just toggle between the two using this arrow. And so whatever's on top is the color you have by default and available. Or you could use the shortcut X to toggle between the two. These have several panels that you can as well further modify. And so as I'm dragging my cursor and clicking over top the color panel, my foreground color is also changing live too. So that's a good thing to note here. Your sample size, again, can be just 1 pixel or a larger set of pixels, and the difference between the two are that this one will literally select what you're hovering over versus these are more of an average and it won't be such a dramatic change. Your color on top will be the color on the wheel, sorry, will be the color that replaces the color on the bottom portion of the wheel. So what you have on the bottom portion is what is was currently your default, and you will switch it to whatever the color you have on top. If we right-click this, we could use the ruler tool, which gives you an accurate measurement of your whatever you're trying to measure. So all I have to do is click and drag, and the lengths will be provided at the top bar over here. But what I find easier is to use these grids at the X and Y axis. So if you don't have that, the shortcut for it is simply Control R, and you'll be able to view it or hide it. So clicking Control R will give me a ruler of what my artboard is, and I use this as like a rough estimation of how large my image is. You can see that there's a line that follows my cursor in both axes. And you can also right-click it to change your unit measurement. So right now I have inches, and you can see it, this image starts at 4 inches and is roughly 10.5. So I know it to be, well, what's the math? 6.5 inches. Right. We have our patch tool, we have our healing brush tools and patch tool that I'll talk about briefly. These remove unwanted or undesired content in an image. So I'll switch to the sky just to briefly talk about how we could paint over top, and Photoshop will recognize the surrounding pixels and use them to help merge and mask over the painted pixels. So I just need to make sure that my brush is large enough to encase whatever content I want to be masked. And you could switch your brush size by right-clicking and adjusting these sliders. I'll make this fairly large like that, and simply click, and Photoshop will use the surrounding blue pixels to cover these birds. I could do so the same with this one, and it works fairly nicely. It's surprising how well it masks these parts of the images. So I'll undo these. The healing brush tool works similarly, where I am basically covering it through pixels, covering the content through pixels, but I'm referencing a part of the image. So what I'm doing is holding Alt or Option on Mac, selecting a part of the image that I'd like to reference. So I'll click, unpress Alt or Option, and we could paint over top our bird now. It should be gone. And they're using the pixels of our reference click. Undo, undo. Lastly, our patch tool is selection based. So we're going to select the area and drag now our selection to another part of the image where we would like it to be copied. So I want a blue that's very similar. Control D to deselect, and you'll see that it's now nicely covered. Our brush tool, shortcut B, is simply a painting tool, paintbrush. Again, right-click to choose different options for your brush in terms of size and hardness. For hardness, it's similar to feathering, where you can have a clear, defined edge if it's at 100%, but if it's lower than that, you'll have something more of a transition or a gradient. Here, I'll paint the blob, and you'll see that I'm taking the color of my foreground. I would advise, again, to create a new layer through this button at the next to the trash can, because you are essentially painting over top of your original image, and those pixels are now modified, so they take on this color, and you wouldn't be able to remove it other than undoing. So I advise creating a new layer and using your any time you're using the brush on this empty layer, so that becomes an editable object. I'll show you guys how the history tool works. So I'll click the panel, and I want to revert all my brush strokes. So I'll go back to this. So I did further. Yep. So I'll select the command above that brush tool command that I did. And from there, any new changes will start from this command. The clone stamp works similarly to the brushes, the healing brushes, where you could reference part of your image and paint over top. But it doesn't do it as well as the healing brushes because it's literally duplicating or cloning that reference that you've clicked on the image. So it does, yeah, it's replicating, and it doesn't have like the intuitive aspect of the healing brushes. So if you want to use that, that's fine. But our history brush, okay, this is an interesting one, will, if we go to the history panel, you'll notice that there is the same icon. So if we wanted to revert back to, say, this quick selection method, anywhere that we paint over top will revert back to this command. And nothing's showing up. I'll go right from the beginning, and I'll have that open. Oh. Okay, I don't know why it's not. I'll go over it again once we make new changes because it's not doing what I want it to do. Eraser tool is self-defined. You're just erasing parts of an image and making everything 100% transparent. And this is also destructive editing. So if you want to revert the change, you have to undo. So that's why I suggest using layer mask to do your edits, because you could bring back some of the transparency even after you've removed it. Tool is the gradient and paint bucket tool. Simply make a solid color. Whatever is in your foreground colors will be the one by default. Again, I suggest making a new layer so that your full color will take up the whole artboard and will be editable. Undo, undo. Gradient tool basically creates a transition from one value or one color to another color. So simply clicking and dragging and selecting the direction that you want will create your gradient. In this panel, if I double click, I have the option to change my colors and change like the parameters of how my gradient will be executed. Double click on this handle and I could select my different colors. And now when I make my new gradient, it should have these new colors. Perfect. The next few tools are destructive editing, so they will make permanent changes to your original image. For example, if I took my person here and I zoomed into her, I can create either a blur, I could sharpen her resolution, or I could smudge her too. These ones are pretty fun because you don't really know what the effect will be until you start really playing with it. So now she's really blurry and would be perfect for a background of a rendering. But now I want to revert the change because I'm not a fan of how blurry she looks. We'll choose this history brush tool now. Go to our history panel and change our icon, deselect it, and place it on the first blur tool. So what this does is I can selectively paint over layers or content in order to revert back to this one command. So if I just wanted half her body to be unblurred, then I'd paint over half of it. Otherwise, I could make the whole change and we should selectively come back to this portion of our history of commands. I'll return this to here and we'll move on to the next tool, which are your dodge, burn, and sponge tool. I'll come back to my little pavilion here, and traditionally dodge and burn are photographic editing tools that make either the image lighter or darker. So if I choose dodge and paint over my pavilion, I can create more highlights from it. And with my dodge tool, right clicking and selecting burn, I can create more shadows. So that's a good way to create contrast in a photo. Your sponge tool has two options. You could desaturate it, which means removing color, or saturate it, which means enhancing the color. So I can paint over top and you'll see that the yellow becomes a lot more yellow in the saturation mode. And clicking desaturate, my shadows will become more tonal and switch to gray and white and blacks. My selection, my pen tool can create different selections that are easy to adjust using these grips and handles. You'll know that you've made a selection when a circle has appeared at your pen icon. And from here, there's several options. You can right click to do similar commands to the marquee and selection tools, such as fill, or we can also create a vector mask, which means that similarly to how I mask this pavilion, I can mask just this selection. Undo, undo. If you want to adjust these grips and handles, the best way is to use this tool called Path Selection Tool. And there's two options. You could either use the path selection to select the whole pen drawing, I'd call it, or select the direct selection tool so you could select the grips and change these. Okay, quickly now, this is just a shape tool, line tool, a lot of different parameters which you can adjust it in terms of color, the border color, the size of it. So we can make it 200 by 200 pixels. And yeah, as long as this is not rasterized, you can pull up this adjust properties panel to update your shape. So what I mean by rasterize is, as Leo was saying, we're converting these to pixels. Otherwise, if it were not rasterized, I undid it. These are vectors and it's based off of equations so that we can constantly update it. Okay, we got our pan tool. So if you're zoomed in and want to just pan around, simply click that. We have the rotate function as well. Holding shift allows you to lock it to specified angles that are orthogonal, just like that. And again, our zoom tool allows you to zoom in and out of the artboard space. Okay, I think I covered everything. That was like a mad dash, but if you guys have any questions, the space to talk is open, or you could simply just put it in the chat. This was a lot to cover, so if you need to, I would suggest go back to this video in order to recall what were some of the commands, but I think I will also make a document showing the different options and a brief description on what these tools are, just for your own reference as well, because I think that would be super useful if you have that to just glaze over.